Hi, I have a Svelte component that on mount makes a fetch request to a REST API endpoint and fetches free users. Now, once it gets a response using await, then it again awaits JSON response. We get the users, it's a list of objects, and when the Svelte iterates over those users, and for each user we create a list element with ID and name, and that's it. So let's write a test for it. I create a file where I imported the users from user Svelte and I imported the mount from Cypress Svelte unit test. Now let's write a test. The first test I'll just say it shows real users, where I will just mount the component. I'm not gonna stop anything. I'll just let that request go all the way to the server and come back. So I'll say mount users. I selected just the subset of a test using a search mocking fetch. That's the name of the folder. So let's click on the spec.js. Great. So we can see that the list is fetched. Now we can assert that there are free users. Great. So we can say get user should have length 3, for example. So we get free li elements and our assertion passes. Let's say that we don't want to go to the real server. Maybe the backend is not there, maybe it's unavailable. It would be nice to write end-to-end component test where the backend is stubbed. So how do we do that? Well, because our component is using window fetch, we can stub that method on a window. So I'll say shows mock users, and we can say our mock users is an array ID, let's say 101, name, Joe 1, and maybe another user 102, name Joe 2. Now we just mounted, we didn't really stub anything, so that's why our test doesn't show anything. Now let's say stub window fetch. So fetch, when you use it, it's actually a property of window. That's why it gets resolved. So here we'll say resolves because it's an asynchronous request. So it resolves with JSON property, which also is an asynchronous operation. So it resolves with mock users, right? And this time it should be 2 users. So what happens now? Perfect. Let me reload. Why is it? Okay, it's not clear. Perfect. So you can see we stub fetch. We can see the fetch request. First fetch was called stub, second was called, and then the 2 users were shown. Nice. Here's a nice little trick. While the fetch is happening, our component is showing a loading element, right? Telling the user, I'm loading. That's why it's right here, right? So let's confirm that this is happening. So I'm gonna take my test and I'm gonna copy it over. Okay, remove this one. Now we'll say shows loading element. So we're gonna simulate a delayed response from the server. So in this case, instead of just saying resolves, I'll say this is my mock response, right? Which is this object. So usually I would just say mock response, but we want to delay that. Now Cypress comes in with Bluebird Promise API available under Cypress Promise. So we can say Cypress Promise resolve. Right, so we'll just create a promise. So that should be the same as before. But once we have a Bluebird promise, we can actually delay it. So we'll use a method called delay and say by 1 second. Nice. So when this stub is called, it actually takes 1 second to resolve. So while this is happening, we can say get loading should be visible. And then later that loading element should go away, so we'll say should not exist. So notice right here the loading element is visible, then we get the same selector and we retry until it doesn't exist, and then the second stub is resolved, because that's when the app is calling await response JSON method, and get user returns 2 elements. So this is how you stub window fetch directly from your component test, and this is how you can create a delayed response by stubbing window fetch and returning a Bluebird promise.